Welcome back. With this video, we're going to return to our study of the Apostolic Fathers. This will be the last of the videos that are titled Apostolic Fathers. And just briefly, before we get to the PowerPoints, a couple of quick points of review. First of all, as we're going to see, you need to remember that the name Apostolic Fathers applies not just to individuals, but also to a certain set of writings that are anonymous. So we're not talking about the authors, we're talking about the actual writing itself. We'll see that in a moment. Furthermore, I want you to remember way back at the earlier this week, in the opening of the videos of the Apostolic Fathers, we said, in addition to giving you the time frame in which it happened and again some of the challenges, we noted that there were 4 of these challenges, and I want to remind you of them again. First of all, there was the challenge of keeping the faith, and just continuing on with what the apostles themselves had revealed concerning the faith, concerning doctrine and teaching in the New Testament. The early church also had to follow through on the Great Commission, bequeathed to them by the apostles. That is, they needed to preach the gospel, Matthew 28:19 and 20, the Great Commission. Next, they had to perpetuate the practices inherited from the apostles. That is, they had to do church, and that means they had to do, again, Acts 2:42 type of things, prayer, following the apostles' teaching, gathering together, and actually doing the ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper, as the Lord himself had given instruction to do, and as the early church followed through on. And they had to maintain the doctrinal integrity of the teaching of the church and teaching of the apostles into the next couple of generations. And we just finished a couple of videos on that last point, because we talked about how the heresy of Ebionism from the Jewish heritage and the ongoing problem of Gnosticism from the Greek philosophical heritage made it incumbent upon them to exhort in sound doctrine and refute those who contradict, as Paul said. Well, with this particular video and lecture, we're going to be returning to and finishing the Apostolic Fathers, as they're called. And so let's turn to those right away. The Apostolic Fathers, again, I want to remind you, are not just individuals, but certain writings that we call by that name. And one of those, an important one of those, is the Didache. Now, the Didache is just a Greek term that means the teaching of the 12, or the teaching. What is the Didache? The word Didache comes from the Greek word related to doctrine, didactic, or teaching, and in English, the Didache is a book of instruction from early church doctrine. It was intended to be sort of a manual for new Christians, we think, and it purported to be the work of the 12 apostles, but again, that's not true. It's a non-canonical book. It's not added to the New Testament. It's believed to have been written between the years AD 70, and again, we said AD 70 is the destruction of the temple, when the Christians, along with a number of other smaller sects, SETC, were spread around. And it's believed to, it's the present version, of the Didache is a reliable guide, many believe, to an understanding of the code of conduct, or how the early church conducted themselves. One author writes, "No document of the early church has proved so bewildering to scholars as this apparently innocent tract, which actually wasn't discovered until 1873. The Didache, or the teaching, that's again what the Greek word means, falls into 2 parts. The first part is a code of Christian morals, and this Christian morals is presented in a way as a choice between the way of life and the way of death. Actually, the Didache deals with 2 roads, one to life and one to death. According to the Didache, the path of life teaches Christians to love the one and only God and love your neighbors yourself, a form of the golden rule as we know it. And of course, this is what Jesus taught when he was dealing with his opposition, the Pharisees, that the 2 sides of the law are to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Various teachings deal with seeing God as all-powerful, seeing him as day and night as a metaphorical way. No doubting whether his word is true. This is the way of the life, keeping the commandments of God, confessing our sins, and coming to prayer with a clear conscience. All of this is seen as the path of life. And all of this, we would say, is more or less, maybe not the way we would put it, but just basic Christian discipleship type of instruction. According to the Didache, the road to death is evil. It's taken by those who persecute the good, not knowing the reward of righteousness. What is found on the path of death is listed in Revelation 22:15, and you can look that up. There is a warning regarding false teachers, and again, this is part of the task, not only to teach sound doctrine, but as we've just said, refute those who contradict and deal with the problem of error and heresy, and the Didache warns against that. Second part of the manual is part of the book is a manual on church order, in which it's laid out simple rules, at times even very sort of naive rules on how the congregation should go about its task of doing church. As we said, this was one of the challenges. It deals with such topics as baptism, fasting, the Lord's Supper, how to deal with our itinerant prophets, and the ministry of the local ministry of the bishops and deacons. We might just comment here, as it says on the side of that slide, the perspective of church order here is rather unsophisticated. It probably reflects the ideas of a single, well-intentioned but naive local bishop. It's pretty basic, and it's very practical, but in some respects it's so basic it doesn't really help very much. It's like, yeah, well, that's obviously what we would do. But it's interesting. One of the most interesting aspects of the teaching of the 12 is the fact that it concludes with a paragraph on the approaching end of the world, which indicates that indeed the early church was interested and even taught on the subject of what we would call eschatology. Second text that we want to look at here, also called one of the church fathers, is the Epistle of Barnabas. The Epistle of Barnabas, or Letter of Barnabas, is an early Christian writing. It's mentioned frequently by other church fathers, using the name of the associate of Paul in the book of Acts, but surely not written by that same Barnabas. They did this a lot. They used the names of famous people or others that in order to try to get a reading or to enhance the prestige of their particular writing or letter. Many times it was perfectly obvious, as it is here, that it wasn't written by Barnabas, and maybe they didn't even intend for people to be fooled by that. I just wanted to mention here, is almost an aside, and it is off to the side there. There's a so-called Gospel of Barnabas, but that is a much later. It's an Islamic redaction of an earlier version that is completely wrong, not worth anything historically, or certainly even theologically. It talks about the life of Jesus from a Muslim point of view, which is completely fictional. Back to the main slide there, it dates somewhere between the late 1st and very early 2nd century. So the text gives us an insight into how Old Testament Jewish laws and traditions were compared and contrasted with Christian practice under the New Covenant. It discusses questions that have been confronting the followers of Jesus since the earliest days, how one ought to interpret the Jewish scriptures, what's the nature between Christianity and Judaism. That's one of the most valuable features of this particular writing, is that it gives us that contrast between Christianity and Judaism. It's really intended to prove that the death of Christ on the cross is a sacrifice that fulfills the plan set forth in the Old Testament. Now, many of us would probably not have difficulty with that as a thesis, but frankly, the way that the gospel, or rather the Epistle of Barnabas, teaches this is something we probably wouldn't accept, because there's a lot of allegorical interpretation. We would accept that there are a number of Old Testament messianic texts, Genesis 3:15 pointing to the Savior, more clearly Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and other texts like that, we wouldn't need to use allegorical methods to demonstrate that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. Here, again, the author attempts to show that only Christians understand the true meaning of the Scriptures and that they're the true intended heirs of God's covenant promise. And some of us, and I would, have a problem with that in particular, because I do believe that God's purposes for national Israel are still in effect. But many others would sort of go along with that sort of idea. In short, the Epistle of Barnabas is a good and early example of what came to be the dominant method of interpreting the Bible in the early and medieval church, that is, the allegorical method. Roger Olson says this: like other Apostolic Fathers, the Epistle of Barnabas portrays the way of salvation primarily in moralistic terms. Barnabas emphasizes a legalistic life of do's and don'ts as a part and parcel of receiving final salvation. So we can see that it made this particular epistle makes some pretty crucial errors with respect to salvation. The next one of these writings, again referred to as Apostolic Fathers, is the Shepherd of Hermas. One author writes concerning the Shepherd of Hermas: it is a strange allegory written sometime in the 2nd century and had a great vogue in the Orthodox circles, was even included in some copies of the New Testament. It's found in the very famous Sinaitic Codex, and so apparently some thought that it should be included with the canon, but it didn't make it, and rather obviously so, because it's a pretty fantastical and frankly, in some respects, problematic testimony to the beliefs of the early church. In short, this story, or allegory, in this story, an individual named Hermas, so the Shepherd of Hermas, a freed Christian slave, devout man, has a series of visions. And in these visions, he has some moral instructions, more or less particularly for the people that he happens to meet. The work is divided into 3 sections. The first section has 5 visions. The second section presents 12 mandates, and the last section composed of 10 parables. The mandates are really kind of like, instructions, or again, visions telling people what they need to know and what God wants them to do about it. Continuing the quotation, the Shepherd of Hermas is also significant in that some of its visions definitely seem to subscribe to a premillennial understanding of the end times. That is, some scholars even see hints of pre-tribulationism in the Shepherd of Hermas. Now, that can be either problematic, but if you are premillennial and you believe in a premillennial pre-tribulation rapture, well, it indicates that at least some people in the early church had notions that there would be a coming literal earthly kingdom. Back to the quotation, the existence of premillennial thinking in a Christian work from the 2nd or 3rd century gives credence to premillennial theologians' arguments against the idea that amillennialism was the universally held belief in the early church. It's very clear that a number of positions on eschatology were prevalent in the early church, and it's difficult to say which ones were more prevalent than others. The theology of the church must have been very elastic, this author says, at the time, and such a book could enjoy popularity and implicit, if not explicit, ecclesiastical sanction. That is, if it got circulation, if it was quoted, it was referred to, then what this author thinks is something, I think he thinks it's somewhat fantastical view of the possibility of an actual literal millennium, as many people do. I don't, but they would have found this to be somewhat curious to have such a position indicated in a very early work in the church. And finally, a work that's really not a work. It is what it says there, the Fragments of Papias. This individual, Papias of Hierapolis, flourished in the early. Hierapolis is a city near Colossae and a couple of the other, Laodicea, a couple of the other cities mentioned in the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. This individual flourished in the early 2nd century and wrote 5 books of exposition of dominical oracles. That is basically the kind of instruction that would have instructed bishops and leaders in the church. The problem is that they're just fragments. We don't have the completed work. All we have are scattered quotations from his readers. But the fathers, the other fathers, we're going to see some of the people that are coming up. Irenaeus, Eusebius, who is the church historian, Apollinarius, who turns out to be someone that advocated a heretical point of view much later. They all quoted, so they must have had the books that Papias wrote, but the books themselves don't survive. But we have so many extensive quotations, long quotations, from Papias's work. It indicates that, at least back in his day, people found him very helpful. As this author says, he appears to have been a well-respected and widely quoted in the early centuries of the church. And as we've seen before with a couple of the others of these apostolic fathers, it seems that it's possible that he even had some contact with the Apostle John. So Papias provides some of the earliest testimony about the early church's stance in the millennium. So that's another, along with what we just saw with previous church fathers, these writings. Apparently he expected a literal millennium. What's most helpful in terms of these fragments of Papias is that he makes allusion to and quotes extensively from Matthew, Mark, John, and Revelation. And this is really the main reason why these fragments remain interesting to us today, because it gives an indication that these books, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John, and even the book of the Revelation, which most scholars think it was written late, but must have been in pretty wide circulation for Papias to be quoting from it, and he would have expected others to know what he's quoting. However, since all of his comments and views come to us in fragments quoted by others, his statements can be more baffling than helpful at times. So again, sometimes those that quote Papias seem to be either arguing with him or quoting him because they agree with him. That's never altogether clear. So Papias's writings have been the source of a great deal of scholarly debate, frankly. So, summarizing the Apostolic Fathers, this goes clear back to the earlier lectures. Mostly, basically, moralistic. They don't display a sophisticated, but rather an unsophisticated sort of view of the church and how to do church, and even somewhat questionable theology when it comes to things like the person of Christ, and as we were just talking about, eschatological views. More importantly for us, regarding the doctrines of the Trinity and the deity of Christ, the post-apostolic fathers were generally committed to both monotheism and the deity of Christ. But they really didn't make it clear how you reconciled those two. But this is what we face when we look at the New Testament. It's clear that there is one God. It's clear that the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Spirit is God. So how do you reconcile monotheism with the deity of Christ and the deity of the Spirit? As one author notes, the post-apostolic fathers appear as witnesses to the traditional faith rather than interpreters striving to understand it. In other words, they clearly believed that there was one God, and that Christ was God, and the Father was God, and the Spirit was God. But how to reconcile that, they didn't spend a lot of time on that. They were moralistic on the matters of salvation, so we would have a little bit of a difficulty with them. They apparently didn't really understand, as the later history is going to show, particularly the Reformation, the justification by faith alone. They introduced ideas such as the authority of the bishops that led to the hierarchicalism and top-down forms of government that eventually progressed into the kind of hierarchy that we see in the Roman Catholic Church today. And I might pause there on that one. That the point there was they recognized they needed to stand against error, and they needed to have somebody who would have the authority to stand against error. But sometimes they gave too much authority to the bishops without pointing to the scriptures themselves, which, again, to give them the benefit of the doubt, were in the process of being formed into the canon. So it was a complex time. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But they did introduce these ideas of the bishops of the church, the leaders of the church, having more authority than we might think the New Testament actually gives them justification for. But again, in fairness, it may have made sense since the apostles were gone and the New Testament hadn't been written, as I just said. Somebody had to authoritatively express the rule of faith. And in your reading, you should read up on, you will be reading up on the whole definition of the rule of faith. Well, once again, we've come to the end of our lecture at this point. So let me encourage you to do a good summary of all of these lectures for this second week. I know that there's more lectures in this week, and in the next couple of weeks there will be quite a few lectures for each set of PowerPoints for each week. But in future, we're going to try and smooth that out a little bit. But happy listening, and looking forward to your summaries of these videos. We'll see you next time.